Jahnavi Phalkey. Now, Jahnavi has carved out a distinguished career. She's a filmmaker and an historian of science and technology, and formerly she worked at King's College London. She's the founding director of Science Gallery Bengaluru and the Satush Mukherjee Visiting Professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. She's an author, producer, filmmaker, and an all-round superstar of the science communication field. Jahnavi, I'd invite you to the stage.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I've always wanted to grow up and become a rock star, so superstar wasn't quite on my radar. But that'll do for the meanwhile. It's a huge pleasure for me to be with you this morning. This is my first meeting with colleagues from the science communication community, so it's a pleasure all the more. Especially since I've dedicated the last 5 years of my life establishing Science Gallery Bengaluru. So one of the reasons why I asked Jenny and Tos if I could speak after the fellows was to get a handle on the kind of concerns that my colleagues have, and then speak to it from my own experience. Also from a place of curiosity, because the manner in which we characterize cultures and countries and settings that somehow deviate from the norm that has come to be established as the West, largely Euro-America. Australia, of course, slides in always, so does New Zealand. So, why? Why? At a meeting of the Science Museum in London, we tried to tackle with similar questions, where I worked with them as an external scholar and an external curator. One of the concerns was, how do you get a diverse audience into the museum? And by the end of the day, much of which was probably less complex in terms of its discussion than the panel we've just witnessed, I could summarize it in 2 phrases. One, and this is largely true of institutions in Europe, in America, and to some extent we are unfortunately also borrowing those frameworks, as my colleague said earlier, also in countries like India and elsewhere. It's about rules of separate engagement and separate rules of engagement. So cultures are declared diverse, and then they are dealt with separately with rules that are separate to the kinds of engagement, kinds of rules of engagement that are used otherwise for what is considered normal. That has consequences, because the assumptions inherent to that kind of understanding of diversity is that diversity is incommensurate, antagonistic, and incompatible, none of which is true, as we've seen again and again historically. There are other kinds of fault lines in different kinds of societies, including the country where I live now, but those aren't necessarily always congruous or coterminous with diversity. We spoke about wealth, poverty, and communication. I will place before ourselves 3 of the most pertinent questions that we as science communicators or people who deal with public engagement with science have confronted in the last decade, more forcefully in the last decade than earlier. Creationism, climate change denial, and anti-vaxxers. If one looks at the distribution of this challenge, one might identify where those problems actually arise more forcefully and highly problematically. Inequity, inequality, again, are questions that are raised about contexts other than Europe and America. Just to give you a few numbers, I had a screenshot, which I've conveniently left in my bag now. 3.9 million children, or 1 out of every 4 children, live in poverty in the United Kingdom. 11.6 million children live in poverty in the United States. So questions of wealth, of poverty, of diversity are not questions of countries, contexts, and locations outside of Europe and America. We spoke about water problems in South Africa. I'm sure nobody in this room has forgotten Flint, Michigan. And that was one of the starkest examples, but I'm sure we know many around us that are equally stark. So, why communicate? Why engage? And where is one to begin if the fault lines don't lie along wealth, poverty, and diversity? If the major problems that we confront today are climate change, pandemics, migration, and at that scale and along those lines, then essentially we are looking at problems of science communication or public engagement with science as global. These are problems that seldom have traction, utility, or even the ability to be addressed entirely locally. Our challenges are global, and therefore we need to think beyond these kinds of boundaries and how these problems manifest, of course, in specific ways, in specific contexts, and therefore also question, like the rest of our colleagues in different kinds of institutions, including academia, but not restricted to academia alone, how useful are frameworks of the nation and nation state to be analyzing, understanding, or dissecting problems for science communication or public engagement with science. I look at our job as one where we create a sense of proportion. What do I mean by that? When we were doing a research festival or exhibition season on water, one of the facts that stuck with me and has stuck with me to date as a method, as a tool rather than a fact alone, is that 70% of the world's fresh water goes into agriculture. 20% of it goes into industry, 8% in domestic use, and 3% the rest. These are approximate values. I mean, as they say, don't believe numbers you haven't made up yourself. I can promise you I didn't make these up myself. There are various sources from which we culled these numbers. But if that is the concern, then how meaningful is it to communicate about concerns around water entirely locally? Or for that matter, if we are called upon as professionals for public engagement with science, where is it that we are seeking action? Are we still going to seek behavioral change among individuals to address the 8% of freshwater use that can be modified? I'm not trying to say that's trivial. I'm not trying to say that's not required. That's absolutely required. But the scale at which problems arise is the scale at which we need to fashion our own engagement with the world. And this is to be done, I think, also because of the magnitude, but also the intensity, the ferociousness, and the sheer urgency of the kind of problems that we face today. I think it becomes a task for us to enable the path from advocacy alone to intervention. How are we either shaping or enabling intervention? At the Science Gallery International Network, for example, when Andrea Bandeli, who's sitting here somewhere, yes, hello, when he was the director of the network, He shaped something called the Youth Action for Climate Change. That's the kind of activities one would want to shape and one would want to enable. Because that's where the job is. And that's why the journey from communication to engagement is also one that is a call of our times. We also do it in specific ways in Bangalore. We have pioneered a public lab complex with 8 experimental spaces. And the reasoning behind it comes from the following thinking. Among the very first public spaces for science, after the Wunderkammer, or the Cabinet of Curiosities, which was largely closed because, it belonged to the aristocracy and the nobility, science museums were those spaces with natural history collections, as most of us in this room know already. What is critical to note here, and this is where I draw upon my own training in history of science, is that in these spaces, the object of scientific inquiry was in full sight of public viewing. So the researcher, the public, and the object of scientific inquiry occupied the same space. That no longer is the case. Nor can one want for that to be the case, because the nature of scientific inquiry itself has changed. How objects of scientific inquiry are constituted has changed. But I think there's a value to maybe thinking about how might one bring back the relationship between the public and the objects of scientific inquiry that are being looked into with the promise of valued education, or not education, valued knowledge. Knowledge worth knowing is produced through that inquiry. And so if the knowledge that is produced through that inquiry is a common human good, it belongs to everyone, then one might want to think about reviving that relationship of the public to the object of scientific inquiry. And it is from that place that the idea for the public lab complex came up, and also trying to then tweak our exhibitions into more of a research festivals format in order to lay bare how the human, the social, and the natural sciences constitute the objects of their inquiry. Why do they ask different questions of the self-same object of inquiry, and what kinds of credible, if uncertain and tenuous knowledge they come up with. Uncertainty and the communication of it is incredibly important, especially given the kinds of crises that we are asked now to address, intervene in, and help shape responses to. We are missing trust in many kinds of institutions. We're missing trust in, or rather, there's a trust deficit, as the language of the day goes. I often read it on Instagram. I'm of a generation where trust deficit wasn't the thing. You either trusted or you didn't trust. And these institutions include laboratories and the scientific community, but also the government. Our science, is it our task as people involved in science communication and public engagement with science to create trust? Are we a service community for the creation of that trust? Is a question that we need to ask ourselves, I think, quite seriously. Because if on the one hand, we want to wear the critical lens ourselves and question what's happening around us, then asking for or creating trust in institutions that we ourselves critically examine might not stand or sit easy. We're moving, and this is sort of among the last few points that I'm making, we're moving towards a discourse on storytelling. It has become the norm. Storytelling is good, all stories are important, let's all tell stories. I would like to state my discomfort here with that idea, because not all stories are equal, but it's also not that all stories should be or should be made equal. There is a huge problem if I say, and I'll again use an Instagram example thanks to my team, that it's raining outside, and someone says, I'm telling you it's not raining outside. It's a difficult story, and you know, stories are not that simple, right? Stories arise from experiences, stories arise from various filters, various blind spots. So the kinds of stories we confront are ones of vaccination. For example, vaccination is good or vaccination is not good. And I've met professors in science institutions who did not believe, for example, in the COVID vaccine. What does one do at this point of time, right? And I'm not asking us to take a stand, but what I'm asking us to consider quite seriously, in a climate where creationism, climate change denial, and anti-vaxxers have gained very serious traction and visibility, that a part of our job also becomes one of creating the tools for discernment and the ability, when we speak about science and not merely what science wants to communicate to the world, when we speak about science, we place it in context. And that is why the message that my colleagues in the panel gave, for example, of collaboration across knowledge communities, is a very, very important one. Among the first, and I think the most important challenges that I see in countries where science communication has taken less root, so to speak, or is patchy, present in patchy formats, I think professionalization and institutionalization are the two most important tasks to be undertaken. And this is where networks like this one can be incredibly useful, can be supportive, and that's exactly what's happening. We have fellows, we have others as by way of participation. And in giving them support, I think we enable the community to thrive and survive and do what it is that we need to do. In order to address, and I'll end with this thought, the challenge of framing, which is extremely important, not only to ourselves as a community, but also how we see communities. My colleague spoke about othering and various other fault lines along which we have been unable, in fact, to make progress. So I think going beyond those binaries that currently are sort of, hinder, in fact, because someone like Linda should be probably speaking alongside a panel where people are discussing water concerns and science communication, and so on and so forth. That voices belong in context, and that context cannot be reduced to diversity alone. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have time for a couple of questions, and this time we're doing it slightly differently. Some of the students are carrying microphones around, so if you have a question, please put up your hand and a student and a microphone will come to you. Please, Sukyong, microphone down the front.
Right, thank you very much. I'm from Korea. My name is Sukyong, yes. And you are talking about the trust in science. I mean, when we experienced the COVID pandemic, actually, for example, in Korea, we lost lots of trust in science. So in that case, how can we recover? You said that the institution is not, must seriously think about recovering the trust in science. So then is there any strategy or is there any good method to recover trust in science in general or in India? Maybe you are from India, so.
Just before you answer that question, Jahnavi, if anyone else has a question, please put up your hand so we can get the microphone to you. Jahnavi, trust in science.
Yeah. So I think as I hinted, it's often not possible to develop a point in full in a brief address. What is that trust for and who wants it, right? Like how do we view ourselves? First of all, how do we view ourselves as a community? Are we a service community that is meant to, in a way, help the government and the scientific establishment, create trust in the public at large about what they're professing, right? So if we are asking critical questions ourselves, I think that's an essential step before we ask ourselves to, enable that trust. Secondly, trust for what, right? Like it's often, I mean, we're living in a very difficult moment. So, I think in a community like this, I can sort of, break it down and disaggregate it. But when you're outside in the public domain, of course, I'll be far more careful to disaggregate what trust in science might mean. And I think for what is very, very important, because I think rather than asking the public to trust science, it might be useful if we as people who engage with the public at large were to help establish why asking good questions is important and why placing your trust in certain kinds of knowledge and institutions is important. Because if it's only when we enable that is going to happen. Because otherwise, how different is it from saying, trust in this because I'm telling you it is good? It sounds patronizing. It sounds like either a parent or a priest. Trust in this because I'm telling you to trust this, right? So I think our job becomes one of actually raising those critical questions. And I think what's amazing is that we as a community of science, engaging the public with science have not congealed, and for very good reasons. I'm not saying it's easy or that we should, kind of strive for it. But there are other, I'll use the example of art, for example. An art critic is an accepted form of profession, right? Like an accepted profession. But someone asking or evaluating critically science is not quite a part of that same public sphere, because somehow peer review should have taken care of that, right? And so I think we ourselves need to become more alert to what is it that we are enabling, why we are enabling it, and therefore then what are the right kind of questions we should enable in the public discourse in order for that trust to emerge where required and also where, due, right? Rather than sort of a blanket trust. Because, we've used scientific knowledge in the historical past to establish that women have smaller brains than men, for example, or that certain races are less intelligent than other races. And these have been, scientifically held knowledge claims, which, took a while to pull them down. So I think we need to kind of understand what is the beast we are asking to trust. So, yeah.
Bruce is first.
I'm sorry?
Bruce Lowenstein's first.
Oh, Bruce. Oh, sorry, Bruce, I didn't see you there.
Hi, my name is Bruce Lowenstein, a historian of science from the United States. And you made a reference to objects, and I'm wondering about the role of objects, whether you see that as a particularly powerful tool for dealing with some of the kinds of difference that you were very careful to make sure that we don't think about it as in some standard categories. But are there ways we can use objects in more interesting ways as part of our ways of addressing these various, being science critics, and so on?
I'm not sure I got your question. I can't. Could you sort of, sorry, my apologies, could you?
So I'm thinking of the museum context,
Yeah.
where the object itself is so powerful.
Yes.
And does that give us a tool for addressing some of the kinds of difference, the ways we can use objects with different communities
Yeah.
in different ways.
Understood, understood. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, historians of science or even museologists have looked at objects as sort of embodied knowledge, right? Like embodied epistemologies. So effectively, an object carries with it the histories materially of its making, and therefore the social history of its time, as well as the cultural history of its time, the aspirations and motivations of its makers, the aspirations and motivations of its collectors, its origins, etc. So in a way, an object is incredible. And, you know, as a historian of science, I myself have used objects to even tell, you know, tell histories, because precisely of the richness of the things it embodies, apart from epistemic embodiment itself of knowledge. And so, yes, objects are powerful tools. And, you know, ever since Neil McGregor's, History of the World in 100 Objects, several such books and ideas have mushroomed, exhibitions have mushroomed, and, you know, I think it's a very, very good tool, and it's a tool that people are now familiar with, and so there is absolutely no reason why, for example, COVID in 10 objects, or this pandemic in 5 objects, or something, or a tool of this kind cannot be mobilized. Is that sort of a, yeah? Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, objects are very, very powerful.
Okay, one final short question, please.
Jenny Metcalf asking the question. You made an important quote, I thought, or asked a question. Are we a service community for the creation of trust? And I thought that was a really important question for us to consider. You then said we needed to create tools of discernment, and you talked about the importance of professionalism and institutionalisation of a community such as ours. What do you think the next steps are for our community in that respect to create those tools of discernment?
Jahnavi, I'm sorry, we only have a couple of minutes left, so it's a big question, but do your best.
I will try my best. So it is literally the linchpin, right? Like, I mean, how do you create the tools of discernment? And I think we are trying out a couple of experiments in Bangalore. So one, as I said, we took the Science Gallery exhibition format, which was one of bringing scientists and artists together to create public engagement as an experience. We're moving from there to bring the knowledge community in fully. And you know, so like when I said, so just to give you an example, when we did the Research Festival on Contagion, we had 28 speakers from across disciplines: sociologists, epidemiologists, modelers, vaccine makers, vaccine activists, historians, people talking about computer viruses, people talking about contagious nature of energy on the dance floor, etc., etc., etc. They were all trying to grapple in very rigorous ways what contagion was, right? So when you put this out, when you put formats such as these, and we have many others as well, which I'm very happy to speak to anyone who wants to after I've stepped down from here, is that the encouragement is to understand how knowledge gets made and why that might matter to your life. It's a long drawn process, but we are participants, not just mere enablers, I think, in that process. And it's through that then you kind of, you understand that a historian has equally important things to say to contagion as a vaccine maker has. And that one message alone is not important, because that's when you understand you might have made the vaccine, but if people resist, then you need to get the Queen to get herself inoculated in the public domain in order for that to proceed forward. And so then those things converge by example, through objects, through other things. There's a possibility that someone is allowed to make up their own mind about what's at stake. And so I think those are the tools we need to create. It's a long journey, but then, we've come this far. There's no reason why we can't go much further.